My boss's daughter jumped into the car. Then she whispered, "Take me somewhere private." The passenger door of my Corolla flew open before I'd even finished backing out of the parking spot, and Charlotte Whitcombe dropped into the seat beside me like she'd been planning the move for an hour instead of executing it in about 4 seconds flat. "Drive," she said, breathless, not looking at me, staring straight ahead through the windshield at the gala lights still glowing behind us. "Please, just drive." I sat there with my foot on the brake, absolutely certain I'd misunderstood something fundamental about the last 30 seconds of my life. "I'm sorry." "What?" She turned to look at me then, mascara starting to blur at the corners of her eyes, and leaned in close enough that I could smell her perfume over the stale coffee smell of my own car. "Take me somewhere private," she whispered, like the words themselves were dangerous. Like saying them any louder might summon someone back out into that parking lot after her. I want to be clear that in the half-second after she said that, my brain did something genuinely embarrassing. It jumped straight to the worst, most inappropriate interpretation available. The kind of thought that made my ears go hot, even as some more sensible part of me registered that the woman sitting beside me was visibly shaking, visibly upset, and very clearly not propositioning anyone. "Somewhere private," I repeated, mostly to buy myself time to catch up. "Not like that." She caught my expression and something flickered across her face. Exhausted amusement layered over real distress. "God, not like that. I mean, away from cameras, away from people, anywhere that isn't back there. I want to explain, before this gets any stranger, exactly who I am and how I ended up being the person Charlotte Whitcombe chose to fling herself at in a parking lot, full of considerably more important cars than mine. My name's Miles Doran. I'm 27, and I work IT support at Whitcombe Logistics, a mid-sized freight and shipping company headquartered in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. Founded 30 years ago by Arthur Whitcombe and currently employing about 400 people across 3 states. I fix printers. I reset passwords. I occasionally get called in when someone in accounting manages to break something in a way that shouldn't technically be possible. It is not a glamorous job, and I have never once wanted it to be, because I learned early in my career that the safest place to sit in any organization is exactly where nobody is looking at you. I developed that particular skill on purpose, somewhere around my second job out of college, after watching a coworker get unfairly blamed for a mistake that wasn't hers, simply because she'd made herself visible enough to be an easy target when something went wrong. I'd decided, consciously, that I would rather be reliable and forgettable than talented and exposed. It had worked out fine for 5 years at Whitcombe Logistics. I showed up. I fixed things. I went home, and nobody ever had a reason to remember my name outside of the ticketing system. I had precisely one goal at that company, which was to remain exactly as unremarkable as I'd been the day I started. My apartment reflected the same philosophy, honestly. A small 1-bedroom on the quieter side of Cedar Rapids, furnished mostly with things I'd inherited or bought second-hand. Nothing that announced much about who lived there. My parents had divorced messily when I was in high school, both of them dragging me into a custody dispute that had, in retrospect, taught me most of what I knew about the cost of being visible in a conflict that wasn't fully mine to fight. I'd watched 2 people I loved use me as a bargaining chip in their own war for years, and I'd come out the other side of it with a deep, abiding preference for staying out of other people's conflicts entirely, my own included. That plan lasted right up until the night of the Calloway merger gala, when Arthur Whitcombe's only daughter climbed into my car and whispered 4 words that made it very clear my streak of invisibility had officially ended. The gala itself had been a big deal for the company, the kind of event that got the entire office buzzing for weeks beforehand. Whitcombe Logistics was finalizing a merger with Calloway Shipping, a larger competitor out of Chicago, a deal that would roughly double the size of the combined company and, according to every rumor circulating through the break room, secure everyone's jobs for at least the next decade. I'd only gone because attendance was quietly mandatory for anyone above entry level, and I'd spent most of the evening exactly where I preferred to be, near the back wall, nursing a single drink, doing my level best to remain part of the scenery. I'd seen Charlotte Whitcombe around the office a handful of times over the years. Mostly during the summers she'd interned in marketing before finishing her degree, and more recently at company events like this one. Always dressed like she belonged somewhere more important, always surrounded by people who clearly wanted something from her, whether that was her father's attention or just proximity to money. We'd exchanged maybe a dozen words total in 5 years, mostly logistics-related pleasantries when I'd fixed her laptop during one of those internship summers. I doubted, walking into that gala, that she could have picked me out of a lineup. I remembered the laptop incident more clearly than I probably should have. Actually, given how minor it had been at the time, she'd been 21, a junior in college, interning for the summer, and clearly terrified of losing 3 weeks of marketing research to a corrupted hard drive 2 days before a presentation to her father's executive team. I'd stayed late that evening recovering the files, and she'd brought me a coffee afterward as thanks. Sitting on the edge of my desk for a few minutes, asking surprisingly specific questions about how the recovery software actually worked. More curious than the situation strictly required. I'd chalked it up, at the time, to nerves needing an outlet. Looking back, it was probably the first small evidence that Charlotte Whitcombe paid more attention to the people around her than most people in her position bothered to. The evening had been proceeding exactly as these things usually did. Speeches, et champagne, a string quartet playing something forgettable in the corner, until Arthur Whitcombe took the small stage set up near the dance floor, tapped his glass for attention, and announced, with the beaming confidence of a man who considered the matter already settled, that the merger between Whitcombe Logistics and Calloway Shipping would be sealed not just on paper, but through family, that his daughter Charlotte would be marrying Weston Calloway, the son of his new business partner, within the year. I remember the room's reaction more clearly than almost anything else that night. The scattered applause, the murmur of approval from people who clearly thought this was romantic instead of what it actually was, and, cutting through all of it, the specific, frozen expression on Charlotte Whitcombe's face as she stood beside her father on that small stage, clearly hearing this news for the first time in her entire life, at the exact same moment as everyone else in that room. Beside me at the back wall, one of the account managers had actually murmured something about how romantic it was. 2 families joined together like something out of an old novel, and I remember feeling a genuine flash of anger on Charlotte's behalf, watching her perform gratitude for an announcement she'd clearly never agreed to. Nobody else in that room seemed to notice what I'd noticed, the specific, practiced quality of her smile, the way her eyes had gone glassy and distant, even as her mouth kept moving through all the appropriate responses. I told myself it wasn't my business. I told myself that for approximately the next 30 minutes, right up until she flung open my car door in the parking lot. She'd smiled through it, the practiced, brittle smile of someone raised to perform composure regardless of circumstance, and she'd let Weston Calloway, a tall, polished-looking man I'd never met, take her hand for the cameras, and she'd endured maybe 10 more minutes of congratulations and champagne toasts before she'd excused herself, quietly, toward the restrooms, and simply never come back. I hadn't thought much about any of it, honestly, beyond the vague, second-hand sympathy anyone might feel watching a stranger's life get rearranged in public. I'd finished my drink, decided I'd fulfilled my mandatory attendance requirement, and headed out to the parking lot to go home, my mind already on the drive back, and whatever leftovers were waiting in my fridge. I had absolutely no warning that Charlotte Whitcombe herself was about to become considerably more relevant to my evening than a stranger's engagement announcement had any right to be. "Where are we going?" I asked, finally putting the car in reverse. Since sitting in a parked car in the gala lot seemed considerably more likely to draw attention than actually driving somewhere. "I don't know. Anywhere. Just not there." She twisted around in her seat to look back at the venue's glowing entrance, shrinking slightly as if worried someone might have followed her out. "Please, just drive." "Miles. I'll explain. I promise. I just need 5 minutes where nobody can see me." The fact that she knew my name landed somewhere in my chest with more weight than it probably should have, given everything else happening in that moment. I pulled out of the lot without further argument, merged onto the main road, and drove without any particular destination, mostly just putting distance between us and the gala, while Charlotte Whitcombe sat in my passenger seat with her hands pressed flat against her thighs, breathing like someone working very hard to stop crying. For a few minutes, neither of us said anything. The only sound, the hum of the engine and the occasional streetlight sweeping across the dashboard. I kept both hands on the wheel and my eyes on the road, giving her whatever space she seemed to need, though every instinct I had was screaming to ask what exactly had just happened back there. "You can talk whenever you're ready," I offered, after a few minutes of silence. "Or not. I'm not going to push." "Thank you." She let out a shaky breath. "I'm sorry. This is insane. You barely know me. I just saw your car and I recognized it. And I don't know. Some part of me just decided you looked safe. I fixed your laptop twice. 6 years ago. That's basically our entire relationship." That got a small, surprised laugh out of her. The first sound she'd made that didn't sound like it was fighting back tears. "You remember that?" "I remember most tickets. Occupational hazard." I kept my eyes on the road, giving her space, though I was intensely curious what exactly had just happened back at that gala. "Do you want to tell me what you're running from? Or should I just keep driving in circles until you feel like talking?" "Both, honestly." She wiped under her eyes carefully, trying not to smear her makeup further. "My father just announced my engagement to a man I've met exactly 3 times, in front of 200 people, without asking me a single question about it beforehand. I nearly ran a stop sign. He announced it without telling you first. He told me an hour before the gala started, framed it as good news, told me the Calloway family was thrilled, that it would secure the merger, that it was the smart move for the company." Her voice had gone flat, the specific flatness of someone reciting facts they'd already exhausted themselves being angry about. "He didn't ask me if I wanted to marry Weston Calloway. He informed me that I was going to, the same way he'd informed me about a change in quarterly projections. That's not a proposal. That's a press release. That's exactly what it was." She let out a short, humorless laugh. I stood up there and smiled because 200 people were watching, and I felt like I was watching my whole life get signed away in a merger agreement. And the worst part is I don't even think my father sees it that way. I think he genuinely believes he's doing something good for me, securing my future, tying it to something stable. He's not trying to hurt me. He's trying to save 400 jobs and a company he built from nothing, and somewhere in that math, I stopped being his daughter and became a line item. We drove for a while in silence after that, past the edge of downtown, out toward the reservoir where the roads got quieter and the streetlights got farther apart. I pulled into the small gravel lot near the water, cut the engine, and we sat there listening to the engine tick as it cooled, the lake dark and still in front of us. "This work?" I asked. "For private? This is perfect." She leaned her head back against the seat, closing her eyes. "Thank you. I don't know why I picked your car specifically. I think I just needed to be near someone who had absolutely nothing to gain from any of this." "I'm not sure that's a compliment, but I'll take it. It's the highest compliment I've got tonight." She opened her eyes and looked over at me. Something curious in her expression now, that the initial panic had faded. You really don't want anything from me, do you? Most people at that company either want my father's attention or my attention specifically because of who my father is. You've spent 5 years apparently trying to be invisible. Guilty. I shrugged, a little embarrassed at how accurately she'd read a strategy I'd never actually voiced out loud to anyone. It's easier. Nobody blames the invisible guy when something goes wrong. Nobody expects anything from him either. That sounds lonely. It sounds safe. There's a difference, though even as I said it, something about the way she'd phrased it landed harder than I expected. Sitting there in a dark parking lot with a woman whose entire life had just been rearranged in a single sentence by her own father. She was quiet for a while, watching the water. Her arms wrapped around herself against the chill coming through the cracked window. I keep thinking about how many people were in that room tonight, and how not one of them thought to ask me a single question before congratulating me. Not one. It's like the second my father said the word engagement, I stopped being a person with an opinion and became an occasion to celebrate. For what it's worth, I noticed. I don't think I was the only one, honestly, but I definitely noticed. What did you notice? That your smile didn't reach anywhere close to your eyes the entire time you were up on that stage. That you looked like someone watching her own life get narrated by somebody else. I said it carefully, not wanting to overstep, but it seemed to land the way I'd hoped. Something in her posture easing slightly. That's exactly what it felt like, she said quietly. Thank you for actually seeing that, instead of just clapping along with everyone else. We sat there for a long while after that, not talking about much of anything. Just the two of us watching the dark water and the occasional headlights passing on the far road. And by the time she finally asked me to drive her back to get her own car, something had shifted between us that I didn't have a name for yet. A kind of easy, unlikely comfort neither of us had expected walking into that gala parking lot a few hours earlier. I didn't hear from her for 4 days after that, and I spent most of those 4 days telling myself the whole strange evening had probably meant more to me than it had to her, that she'd likely forget the invisible IT guy who'd driven her to a reservoir the second her actual life resumed its normal, complicated shape. I went back to fixing printers, resetting passwords, doing my level best to disappear back into the scenery I'd spent 5 years cultivating. It was Thursday afternoon when she found me at my desk in the small IT alcove near the server room, appearing without warning the way she apparently specialized in, leaning against the doorframe with 2 coffees in hand. I come bearing bribes, she said, holding one out to me, for emotional damages incurred during your unplanned taxi service. You didn't have to do that. I wanted to. She set the coffee on my desk when I didn't immediately take it, apparently unwilling to be denied the gesture. Also, I wanted to apologize properly for the parking lot thing. I've been mortified about it for 4 days. That's not normal behavior. Jumping into a coworker's car and demanding to be driven somewhere. It was fine. Genuinely. I finally picked up the coffee, if only to have something to do with my hands. You needed to get out of there. I happened to be the exit route. You were a remarkably calm exit route, all things considered. She glanced around the small alcove, at the server racks humming quietly against the far wall, apparently in no hurry to leave. How does someone end up this composed about a stranger hijacking their car? You weren't a stranger. Technically, we had the laptop thing. The laptop thing, she smiled, small and genuine. Nothing like the brittle performance smile I'd watched her wear on that stage 4 nights earlier. I looked you up, actually, after Miles Doran. IT. Support. 5 years at the company. Apparently something of a legend for how quietly he does his job. Nobody, I asked, could tell me a single interesting thing about you, which I've decided is either the most boring or the most impressive thing I've ever heard about a person. I'll take impressive. I thought you might. She lingered a moment longer, and I got the distinct sense she wanted to say something else, something she hadn't quite worked up to yet. Anyway, thank you again. For the reservoir, for not asking too many questions, for not being one more person angling for something from the situation. Anytime, I said, and meant it more than I probably should have, given that the situation in question involved my boss's daughter and an engagement I had absolutely no business being curious about. She stayed a few more minutes, asking oddly specific questions about the server rack humming against the wall, the kind of curiosity I recognized now from the laptop incident years earlier. And when she finally left, she paused at the doorway to add, almost as an afterthought, "For what it's worth, you're the only person who's talked to me since the gala without immediately asking about the wedding. It's been surprisingly restful." She came by again the following week, and the week after that, always with some flimsy IT-adjacent pretext, a computer that was acting strange, a printer that definitely wasn't working right, problems that resolved themselves suspiciously quickly once I actually looked at them, which told me clearly enough that the visits were less about hardware and more about something neither of us was quite ready to name yet. It was during one of those visits, about 3 weeks after the gala, that Jenna, from accounting, who occupied the desk closest to the IT alcove and had apparently been quietly monitoring the pattern, cornered me by the coffee machine. "You know, that's Arthur Whitcombe's daughter coming by here twice a week," she said. "Not quite a question. I'm aware. She's engaged. Miles. I'm aware of that too. I'm just saying, whatever this is, it's the kind of thing that ends careers in a building this size." Jenna wasn't being unkind about it, just practical. The way people who've worked somewhere long enough tend to be about the specific gravities of office politics. She'd been at Whitcombe Logistics for nearly 15 years, had watched 2 rounds of layoffs and 1 messy executive scandal, and had developed, in that time, a fairly reliable instinct for which situations tended to end badly for the smaller, less powerful person involved. "I like you. I'd hate to watch you get flattened by something that isn't even your fault. There's nothing happening. Jenna. She's just going through something, and I happen to be a person she talks to about it," which was true. Mostly. Though even as I said it, I understood I was leaving out the part where I'd started looking forward to those visits with an intensity that had nothing to do with printer maintenance. Ooh. Jenna gave me a look that suggested she believed exactly none of that, and headed back to her desk, leaving me standing there with a lukewarm coffee and the specific unease of someone who'd just heard an outside observer name, something he'd been carefully avoiding, naming himself. I thought about her warning more than I wanted to admit over the following days, running the calculation the same way I'd run every calculation for 5 years at that company. There was a version of this where I simply stopped answering Charlotte's visits with anything more than professional courtesy, where I quietly retreated back into the invisibility I'd spent years cultivating, and let whatever this was between us wither before it ever properly started. It would have been the safe choice. It would have also, I was slowly starting to realize, been a lie about how I actually felt, which was a currency I'd started running low on patience for. The real complication arrived about a month after the gala, in the form of a mandatory all-staff meeting announcing the finalized merger timeline, which included, prominently displayed on a slide nobody had bothered to warn me about, a save-the-date for the Weston Calloway engagement celebration, a formal event scheduled for 6 weeks out, where the 2 families would publicly cement the arrangement in front of both companies' combined leadership. Charlotte found me afterward, in the alcove, looking considerably paler than her usual composed self. 6 weeks, she said, dropping into the spare chair I kept for people waiting on their computers to reboot. "They've scheduled the engagement celebration. Weston's parents are flying in. There's a photographer booked. My father sent me a dress designer's contact information this morning like this is a corporate retreat instead of my actual life. Have you told him how you feel about any of this?" "I've tried," He doesn't hear it as feelings. Miles. He hears it as cold feet, as normal pre-wedding nerves, as something that'll resolve itself once the deal is secured and everyone's relieved, the merger held together. She rubbed her temples, the specific gesture of someone who'd had this same argument with herself many times already. He genuinely believes this is good for me. That's the part that makes it so hard to fight. He's not a villain in this. He's just a man who's spent 30 years learning to solve every problem with a strategic decision. And somewhere along the way, he forgot that I'm not one of his logistics contracts. What do you actually want? The question seemed to catch her off guard, like nobody had asked it plainly in longer than she wanted to admit. I don't know anymore. I know I don't want to marry Weston Calloway. I know I'm terrified of what happens to my father's company and to 400 people's jobs. If I refuse, and the Calloways decide the partnership isn't worth pursuing without the family tie holding it together. She looked up at me, something raw in her expression. I know that the only time I've felt like an actual person instead of a strategic asset in the last month was sitting in a parking lot by the reservoir with someone who had absolutely no stake in any of this. I should have said something careful there, something appropriately cautious, given everything Jenna had warned me about, given the very obvious gulf between an IT support technician and the daughter of the company's founder. Instead, I said, for what it's worth, you're not a strategic asset to me. You're just Charlotte. That's the only version of you I actually know. Something shifted in her expression, gratitude tangled with something else I wasn't ready to name yet either. That might be the nicest thing anyone's said to me since this whole nightmare started. I set a low bar. Then, if a coworker being decent to you is the nicest thing that's happened in a month, you'd be surprised how low the bar actually is. Once money and mergers get involved. She stood, smoothing her skirt, though she lingered a moment longer at the doorway. Thank you, Miles, for being the one person in this building who doesn't want anything from me. I watched her go, and sat there afterward with the specific, unsettled feeling of a man who'd just realized that particular claim wasn't entirely true anymore. Though I wasn't yet ready to admit exactly what it was I'd started wanting instead. The engagement celebration arrived faster than 6 weeks felt like it should have, and I attended. Again, because attendance for anyone above entry level was quietly mandatory. And this time I found myself considerably less content to remain part of the scenery than I had been at the previous gala. Charlotte stood beside Weston Calloway for most of the evening, performing the same brittle, practiced composure I'd watched her wear once before, and I stood near the back wall, doing my best impression of a man who wasn't watching her more closely than any IT technician had any professional reason to. Weston himself seemed pleasant enough in a distant, polished way, the kind of man raised to charm rooms without ever actually revealing anything genuine about himself. And I found myself disliking him not for any specific fault but simply for the unbearable ease with which he accepted an arrangement Charlotte had clearly never agreed to in any meaningful sense. It was during the toasts, watching Arthur Whitcombe raise his glass with the same beaming, oblivious confidence he'd shown at the first gala, that I caught Charlotte's eye across the room, and something passed between us. A silent, exhausted plea that needed no further translation. I found her 20 minutes later on the building's side terrace, having apparently slipped away from the reception the moment she could manage it without drawing too much attention. You're doing the panicked math face again, I said, coming to stand beside her at the railing, the one from the parking lot. I'm doing the math on how many more of these events I can survive before I actually say something in front of everyone. She wrapped her arms around herself against the evening chill. I keep telling myself I'll talk to my father properly tomorrow, and tomorrow becomes next week, and next week becomes the actual wedding date if I'm not careful. What's stopping you? The same thing that's always stopped me. 400 jobs. A company he built from nothing. The specific look on his face if I tell him I'd rather blow up the biggest deal of his career than marry a man I don't love. She looked over at me, something fierce and frightened tangled together in her expression. "What would you do if you were me?" I thought about Jenna's warning, about 5 years of careful invisibility, about every reason I had to stay exactly where I was supposed to stay in this specific hierarchy. Then I thought about the reservoir, about every visit to the IT alcove that had nothing to do with printers, about how thoroughly I'd stopped wanting to be invisible around her specifically. "I'd tell the truth," I said, "even if it's inconvenient, even if it costs something. I think you deserve a life you actually chose, not one that got announced on a stage before anyone asked you a single question about it. That's easy for you to say. You're not the one who has to look my father in the eye and tell him he might have just wrecked the biggest deal of his career. No, but I'm the one standing here, watching you disappear into a life that isn't yours. And I'd rather say something inconvenient than watch that happen without ever telling you what I actually think." The words came out steadier than I expected, given how far outside my usual careful caution they landed. "I know I'm not supposed to have an opinion about any of this. I know exactly where I sit on the org chart relative to you. I'm telling you anyway, because I think somebody in your life should be honest with you instead of strategic." For a long moment she just looked at me, something breaking loose behind her eyes. And then, before I could second-guess anything further, she closed the distance between us and kissed me, quick and startled, like she'd surprised herself as much as she'd surprised me. "I'm sorry," she said immediately, pulling back, hand pressed to her mouth. "I shouldn't have. You work for my father. I'm engaged, at least on paper. This is a spectacularly bad idea on every possible level." "Probably," I agreed. "I'm not sorry, though." "Neither am I," she admitted, quiet, almost surprised at her own honesty. "I've been thinking about that parking lot for a month straight. Miles, about the reservoir, about the fact that you're the only person who's talked to me like an actual human being since this entire nightmare started." "Same," I said, "which is a genuinely terrible position for both of us to be in, given the org chart. Genuinely terrible," she agreed, and laughed despite herself. A real laugh, startled out of her by the sheer absurdity of the whole situation. "What do we do?" "I don't know yet, but I know I'd rather figure it out honestly than keep pretending neither of us feels anything, while you get walked down an aisle toward a man you don't love." We didn't solve anything that night, standing on that terrace with the reception noise carrying faintly behind us. But something had shifted, decisively, in the space of that single, unplanned kiss, and both of us knew it. Walking back inside, separately a few minutes later, careful to arrive at slightly different times so as not to draw the kind of attention neither of us was ready for yet. The trouble arrived 3 days later, when Arthur Whitcombe himself appeared in the IT alcove, an event significant enough on its own that Jenna actually got up from her desk to watch through the glass wall separating our section from the rest of the floor. Miles. Arthur Whitcombe filled the doorway the way powerful men tend to, not through size specifically, but through the sheer weight of expectation that followed him into any room. He was dressed, as always, in the kind of tailored suit that made every other man in the building look slightly underdressed by comparison. And he studied the small alcove around me with the mild distaste of a man unaccustomed to spending time in spaces this modest. "I understand you've been spending considerable time with my daughter." She stopped by a few times. "Sir, computer issues. Mostly. He let the word sit there, unhurried, studying me with the same appraising precision I imagined he applied to contract negotiations. "I've built this company over 30 years. Miles, I know how to read a situation. I'd like you to understand something clearly, so there's no confusion between us going forward. Charlotte is engaged to Weston Calloway. That engagement secures a merger worth considerably more than your annual salary, and considerably more jobs than just your own. I would hate for any misunderstanding to complicate that, for either of us. I understand the stakes. Sir. Good. Then you'll understand why I'd ask you to keep some professional distance from my daughter, going forward, for everyone's sake. His tone stayed even, almost gentle. The specific gentleness of a powerful man who's confident he'll get his way without needing to raise his voice. I'd hate to have to make a personnel decision I don't actually want to make. Miles, you're good at your job. I'd like to keep you here. He left without waiting for a response, the door swinging shut softly behind him, and Jenna appeared in my doorway approximately 4 seconds later, eyes wide. That was Arthur Whitcombe, in your office. What did he want? He wanted me to know my job's on the line if I keep spending time with his daughter. I sat back in my chair, staring at the blank monitor in front of me, feeling the specific, cold weight of a threat, delivered so politely it barely registered as one until you actually sat with it for a minute. Miles. Jenna's voice had lost all its earlier teasing edge. I like you. I meant that, but I'd think very carefully about this, if I were you. I've been thinking about very little else since he walked in. The threat, wrapped as it was in reasonable, businesslike language, landed exactly as hard as he intended it to. I sat there after he left, staring at my monitor without actually seeing it, running through every version of the calculation Jenna had warned me about weeks earlier. 5 years of careful invisibility, a stable job, a company that employed 400 people whose livelihoods genuinely did depend on a merger I had no right to jeopardize over my own feelings for a woman I'd known, in any real sense, for barely a month. Charlotte found me that evening in the parking lot, having apparently heard about her father's visit from someone in the building's rapid, reliable gossip network. He talked to you, she said, not quite a question. Standing beside my car in the fading evening light, he asked me to keep my distance, politely, with the specific implication that my job was on the line if I didn't. I'm so sorry, Miles. This is exactly what I was afraid would happen. She wrapped her arms around herself, looking genuinely stricken. I never wanted you to get caught in the middle of this. You have nothing to do with the merger. You shouldn't have to pay a price for something that's entirely my father's doing. I'm not blaming you. I leaned against the car, working through what I actually wanted to say next. I've spent 5 years at this company making myself as small and careful as possible, specifically so I'd never end up in a conversation like the one I just had. And somehow, in the last month, I've stopped caring nearly as much about staying invisible as I used to. What does that mean? It means I think your father's threat is exactly the kind of thing that used to work on me, and doesn't anymore. Not entirely. I looked at her directly, deciding, in that moment, that I was done calculating the safest possible response. I meant what I said on that terrace. I'd rather be honest and take the risk than stay safely invisible while you get steered into a life you never actually chose. He could fire you. He could. I've thought about that a great deal in the last few hours. I shrugged, though the gesture cost more than it looked like it should have. I'd rather lose a job I've been quietly hiding inside for 5 years than lose the chance to actually matter to someone, for the first time in longer than I want to admit. Her eyes filled, and she reached for my hand without quite seeming to decide to. I don't want you to lose anything because of me. Then let's not let your father be the only one making decisions here. I laced my fingers through hers. What do you actually want? Charlotte, not what's strategic, not what saves the merger. What do you want? If none of that mattered. I want to marry someone I actually chose, she said, quiet but certain, like she'd been holding the sentence ready for weeks and had finally found the nerve to say it out loud. I want my father to see me as his daughter again, not as a clause in a partnership agreement. And I think, somewhere in the last month, I started wanting you specifically, which is either the bravest or the stupidest thing I've ever admitted to anyone. I'll take either. Both. Honestly, I pulled her closer, and this time neither of us pulled back, the kiss slower and steadier than the frantic, startled one on the terrace 3 nights earlier, Both of us, finally admitting, fully, what had been building since a parking lot and a whispered request for privacy that turned out to mean something entirely different than either of us had first assumed. The confrontation with Arthur Whitcombe came a week later, and Charlotte insisted on handling the first part of it herself, calling a private meeting in his office where she laid out, plainly and without her usual careful diplomacy, exactly how she felt about the engagement, about being announced to 200 people without warning, about a father who'd apparently forgotten how to ask her opinion on anything that mattered. She told me about it afterward, sitting on the tailgate of my truck in the parking lot behind the office, still visibly shaking from the confrontation, but steadier than I'd seen her in weeks. I told him I understand the merger matters. She said, I understand. 400 jobs are riding on this partnership holding together. What I don't understand is why securing that partnership required sacrificing my entire say in my own life. You didn't ask me. Dad, I told him. You informed me, in front of 200 people, and I've spent the last month watching you threaten the one person in this entire company who's ever treated me like a person instead of an asset. How did he take that? Badly. At first, he got very quiet, which, with my father, usually means he's actually listening instead of just waiting for his turn to talk. She wrapped her arms around her knees. He said he built this company for me. Said everything he's done for 30 years has been to give me a stable, secure life. And I told him, you built a company you love. Dad, that's not the same thing as building my life. I need you to understand the difference, because I've spent a month drowning in the gap between them. What did he say to that? Nothing. At first, he just sat there for a long time, looking older than I've ever seen him look, and then he asked me what I actually wanted, which is the first time in 30 years he's asked me that question and actually waited for an answer instead of already having one ready. I reached over and took her hand, giving her the space to keep going if she wanted to. I told him I wanted to marry someone I actually chose. I told him about you. Miles. Everything. The parking lot. The reservoir. The alcove visits. All of it. I told him if the Calloway partnership genuinely needs my marriage to survive, then it's not actually a partnership worth having, and he needs to find a way to make the business case work on its own merits, instead of using me as the collateral. That must have been terrifying to say out loud. It was. It also felt like the first completely honest thing I've said to him in years. She looked over at me. Something exhausted and relieved, tangled together in her expression. He didn't agree to anything on the spot, but he didn't threaten me either, which from my father is practically an admission that I'd made a point he couldn't easily dismiss. The Calloway merger, it turned out, survived the collapse of the engagement anyway. In the end, once Arthur reluctantly agreed to renegotiate the partnership terms directly with Weston's father, on the strength of the business fundamentals alone, rather than a family tie, neither of the actual people involved had ever wanted. The renegotiation took nearly 2 additional months of tense back and forth between the two companies' lawyers, and there were several points along the way when the whole deal looked genuinely at risk of falling apart. But Arthur, to his credit, never once suggested reviving the marriage arrangement as leverage. Weston himself, when the arrangement finally dissolved, seemed almost relieved, admitting privately to Charlotte over coffee one afternoon that he'd been dreading the wedding nearly as much as she had, both of them apparently having spent weeks performing an enthusiasm neither of them actually felt. He'd confessed, she told me later, to being quietly in love with someone else entirely back in Chicago, a woman his own family considered unsuitable for reasons that had nothing to do with her character and everything to do with her family's more modest circumstances, and the two of them had ended up commiserating, oddly, over the specific indignity of having their romantic lives treated as negotiating chips by people who claimed to love them. We should have just talked to each other from the beginning, Charlotte told me, recounting the conversation. We spent 2 months tiptoeing around each other's feelings when we could have just admitted neither of us wanted this, and figured out how to say so together instead of separately. Better late than never. Better late than never, she agreed, and I noticed, not for the first time, how much lighter she seemed since the whole engagement had officially ended. Like a weight she'd been carrying so long she'd forgotten it wasn't a permanent part of her posture had finally been set down. I kept my job, in the end, though Arthur Whitcombe remained cool toward me for a long stretch afterward. The specific cool distance of a powerful man forced to concede a point he hadn't wanted to concede. It took the better part of a year, and considerable patience on both our parts, before he thawed enough to have an actual conversation with me that wasn't laced with quiet threat. I still think I was trying to do right by her, he told me once, at a company barbecue a year after the whole thing had unraveled, watching Charlotte across the lawn with an expression that looked, for the first time since I'd known him, genuinely uncertain of himself. He had a paper plate of barbecue balanced awkwardly in one hand, looking distinctly out of his element away from a boardroom, which was its own small, satisfying novelty. I just kept confusing security with happiness. Took me longer than it should have to see the difference. For what it's worth. Sir, I don't think you're wrong that you love her. I think you just needed reminding that loving someone means asking what they want, not deciding it for them. He studied me for a long moment. The same appraising look he'd given me in that alcove a year earlier, though considerably less hostile this time. You're a stubborn man, Miles. For someone who spent 5 years trying to be invisible, I had a good reason to stop. Apparently so. He set down his paper plate on the nearby table, watching his daughter laugh at something across the lawn, and for a moment his composure slipped into something almost wistful. She hasn't laughed like that in years. Not really. Not the way she does now. He glanced back at me, and something in his expression, grudging but genuine, settled into place. I suppose I should thank you for that, even if it took me an embarrassingly long time to get there. You don't owe me a thank you. Sir, I'd have done it whether you approved or not. I'm aware. That's precisely why I'm giving you one. He almost smiled, an expression that looked distinctly unpracticed on his face, and for the first time in over a year, the conversation between us felt like something closer to an actual truce than a negotiation. We got married 2 years after that parking lot, a small ceremony that Arthur Whitcombe, somewhat to my surprise, walked his daughter down the aisle for with what looked like genuine, unguarded happiness. The specific expression of a man who'd finally learned the difference between securing his daughter's future and actually caring what she wanted from it. Jenna came to the wedding too, cornering me by the bar at one point to remind me, with obvious satisfaction, that she'd called it months before either of us admitted anything, back when she'd first warned me about the danger of getting flattened by something above my pay grade. I stand by the warning, she said, raising her glass. I'm just glad you ignored it anyway. You told me to be careful. Jenna. I was careful. I just decided careful didn't mean invisible anymore. Fair distinction. She clinked her glass against mine, grinning. For what it's worth, half the accounting department had a pool going on how long it would take you two to actually admit what was happening. I won $40 off that pool. So, really, I should be thanking you. Weston sent a card, along with a bottle of good scotch, a short note wishing us well and thanking Charlotte, half joking, for accidentally freeing him to pursue the relationship his own family had once considered unsuitable. He'd married the woman from Chicago the previous spring, apparently with considerably less fanfare and considerably more genuine happiness than the arrangement he and Charlotte had briefly, unwillingly shared. Charlotte's mother, who'd passed away when Charlotte was still in college, wasn't there to see any of it, a fact Charlotte mentioned quietly to me the morning of the wedding. Sitting together in the church's small side room before the ceremony started, she would have liked you, Charlotte said, straightening my tie with the particular focus of someone using a small task to steady larger nerves. She spent years trying to teach my father that love and strategy aren't the same language, and I don't think he ever really learned it until you came along and made him learn it the hard way. I didn't set out to teach your father anything. I know. That's probably why it worked. She kissed my cheek, careful not to smudge her makeup, and squeezed my hand once before her father knocked on the door to walk her down the aisle. The same man who'd once stood in my office doorway delivering a quiet threat, now waiting to give his daughter away to the person that threat had been meant to drive off. The old Corolla still sits in our garage, retired from daily driving duty, but never sold, because Charlotte refused to let it go once I mentioned trading it in for something newer. That car is where I finally got to be a person instead of an asset, she told me, the same way she'd said it a dozen times over the years since. I'm not letting you get rid of the thing that gave me that. We drive out to the reservoir sometimes, on quiet evenings, parking in the same small gravel lot where we'd sat that first night, listening to the engine tick as it cooled. It's become its own small ritual over the years, a place we return to whenever something in either of our lives feels like it needs the specific clarity that comes from sitting quietly together, away from everyone else's opinions about what our lives should look like. Some evenings, when we're both home early enough to actually cook dinner instead of ordering takeout, Charlotte brings up that first night, asks me what I actually thought when she flung open my car door and whispered those 4 words that could have meant something entirely different than they did. I thought my entire quiet, invisible life was about to get considerably more complicated. I tell her, honestly, every time she asks. I was right. As it turns out, I just didn't know yet how glad I'd end up being about it. You looked so panicked, she says, laughing, like I'd asked you to smuggle me across a border instead of just drive me somewhere quiet. You basically had, I just didn't understand the stakes yet. Well, she leans over and kisses me, easy and familiar in the way. 4 years together tends to make even old memories feel warm instead of strange. You caught up eventually. That's what actually mattered. I think, sometimes, about how easily that whole story could have gone differently if I'd driven her straight back to the gala instead of out toward the reservoir. If I'd taken Arthur Whitcombe's warning as the final word instead of the opening move in a much longer negotiation. If I'd stayed exactly as invisible as I'd spent 5 careful years training myself to be. I think about how close I came to letting the safest possible choice win out over the truest one, and I'm endlessly grateful. In a way, I don't think I'll ever stop being grateful. That some part of me finally decided invisibility wasn't actually the same thing as safety. Not when the alternative was watching someone I cared about disappear into a life she never chose. I think, too, about my own parents, about the divorce that had originally taught me to make myself small and forgettable in the middle of other people's conflicts. It's occurred to me more than once, in the years since, that Charlotte's situation and my own childhood shared an uncomfortable amount of overlap, both of us treated, at different points, as pieces to be moved rather than people to be asked. I like to think some part of what drew me toward her in that parking lot, beyond simple attraction, was a recognition I couldn't have articulated at the time. One person who'd learned to disappear, meeting another person who'd just discovered, in the worst possible way, exactly how little, say, she'd been given over her own life. We've talked about it since, late at night. The way people do once enough time has passed to make old wounds feel like material worth examining instead of things to keep carefully buried. Charlotte says she thinks that's exactly why she picked my car that night. Out of every vehicle in that crowded lot, some instinct, recognizing in me a person who understood, on some level, what it felt like to be handled instead of heard. I don't know if that's precisely true, or if it's simply the kind of story we've told ourselves enough times that it's become true in the retelling. Either way, I've stopped needing to untangle exactly why it happened the way it did, I'm just grateful, endlessly, that it did. Jenna still brings up the office betting pool occasionally, usually at company gatherings, always with the specific satisfaction of someone who profited handsomely off other people's slow-building romance. Charlotte finds it endlessly funny that an entire department apparently had money riding on our relationship before either of us had fully admitted it to ourselves, and I've made my peace with being, apparently, considerably more transparent about my feelings than I ever gave myself credit for during those 5 careful years of trying to stay invisible. I still work at Whitcombe Logistics, though the alcove I used to hide in has expanded slightly over the years, along with my job title. A promotion, I'm fairly certain, Arthur Whitcombe engineered specifically to have an excuse to keep an eye on me, without it looking like favoritism. I don't mind. It gives us a reason to talk more often than we otherwise might, and over the years those conversations have slowly stopped feeling like negotiations and started feeling like something closer to family. However slowly and grudgingly that particular transformation arrived. Charlotte left marketing eventually, started her own small consulting firm, advising other family businesses on succession planning. A career choice, she's told me more than once, grew directly out of watching her own father nearly wreck their relationship, trying to solve an emotional problem with a strategic solution. She's good at it, unsurprisingly, having lived through exactly the kind of situation she now helps other families avoid. And she's built, in the years since that gala, a life that looks nothing like the one her father originally announced from that small stage, and everything like the one she actually chose for herself. We don't go to many company galas anymore, not the way we used to, though when we do, I notice she still glances toward the parking lot occasionally, some old habit of checking for an exit route that I don't think will ever fully leave her, even now. Even happy, even years removed from the night, that particular instinct first saved her from a life she never wanted. I've stopped minding the habit. If anything, I've grown fond of it. This small, permanent reminder of the exact moment our entire story actually began, in a parking lot, with a car door flung open, and 4 whispered words that turned out to mean something far better than either of us initially assumed. Sometimes, driving home from one of those events, she'll reach over and rest her hand on my arm, quiet for a moment, and I'll ask what she's thinking about. And more often than not, the answer circles back to that same parking lot, that same reservoir. The specific gratitude of having ended up somewhere so much better than the life that got announced for her on a stage, without her consent, in front of 200 people who thought they were witnessing something romantic. It wasn't romantic, not that night. It was frightening and lonely, and completely outside anything either of us had planned for our lives. It became something else entirely, slowly, over months and then years. Built one honest conversation at a time, the same patient way most good things get built. Once 2 people finally decide honesty matters more than safety. I don't know what would have happened if she'd picked a different car that night, or if I'd been the kind of person who drove her straight back to the party the second she asked me to. I like to think, somewhere underneath all the caution I'd spent 5 years cultivating, some instinct recognized exactly what was actually happening in that parking lot, and knew, even before I fully understood it myself, that staying invisible was never going to be enough anymore. Not once Charlotte Whitcombe had climbed into my passenger seat and asked, in a whisper that shook slightly with everything she was running from, to be taken somewhere private. Our daughter was born last spring, and Charlotte likes to joke that she'll grow up hearing the story of how her parents met, told at least 100 different ways depending on who's telling it. Jenna's version involving a betting pool and $40 in winnings. Her grandfather's version involving a stubborn IT technician who refused to know his place. And our version, the one we actually tell her, about a parking lot, a reservoir, and the specific, quiet courage it takes to stop being invisible for someone worth the risk. I hope, whenever she's old enough to really understand it, that the story teaches her something useful about choosing honesty over safety. The same lesson it took both her parents considerably longer to learn than either of us would like to admit. For now, she's too young for any of that, content mostly to fall asleep in the same old Corolla on drives out to the reservoir, the same gravel lot, the same dark water. 3 generations of a story that started with 4 whispered words in a parking lot outside a gala neither of us particularly wanted to attend in the first place. Some stories start with a grand gesture. Ours started with a car door flung open in a hurry. 4 whispered words meant only to buy 5 minutes of privacy, and it turned out to be more than enough to build an entire life on top of. 1 honest conversation at a time. What would you have done if your boss's daughter jumped into your car and whispered that she needed somewhere private? Would you have assumed the worst the way I briefly did, or figured out the truth faster than I managed to? Have you ever had to choose between playing it safe and telling someone the truth, even when the truth was inconvenient? Tell your story in the comments below. And if you'd like to be a little closer to us, we've opened memberships where you'll get shorter exclusive stories every week with no ads. If you enjoyed this one, leave a like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.